right. So let's get right into it, everyone. I hope everyone's having an awesome day so far. Thanks for joining us. My name is Ryan Robinson. I am the Community Associate at Altimetric Collider. Altimetric is a company that specializes in keeping our clients ahead of the curve in technical innovation. And Collider is the community facing side of the company geared towards tech professionals all over the world, thanks to our new virtual shift. Um, I'm very excited that you all are in attendance for tonight's discussion, Decentralized ID in the Passwordless Future with Detroit Blockchainers. Our moderator, Nate Talbot, has curated an awesome panel of experts who will tell us everything we need to know. Nate Talbot is a Detroit based distributed ledger enthusiast and co founder of the Detroit Blockchain Center. Nate is going to guide us along this DID journey, so feel free to ask any questions in the chat. I'll be keeping my eye out and take it away, Nate.
All right. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you everybody for joining us. Uh, Again, I'm Nate Talbot, the Executive Director of Detroit Blockchain Center, where we are a nonprofit that's dedicated in primarily driving education around blockchain technology um, and finding methods for communities to incorporate it and being a resource for businesses and entrepreneurs looking to uh, start a pathway involving blockchain. Our guest tonight, we have two outstanding guests that we are definitely lucky to have because they're both top of their fields. We have Pramita Mitra, who is a PhD in computer science and engineering from the University of Notre Dame. She is currently the supervisor of IoT and blockchain at Ford Motor Companies and the co-chair of supply chain WG at Mobility Open Blockchain Initiative. And we have Daniel Buchner, who is the project manager of Decentralized Identity at Microsoft. He's a self-taught coder, and he is how I sort of stumbled deeply into decentralized identity. And I know he's leading the charge on creating standards around DID with platforms like the recently launched ION project. I'm going to let them explain to themselves a little bit more specifically on what they do in their fields, and then we'll get more into what decentralized ID, verified credentials, and everything else is. So maybe if you want to start, Pramita, can you tell us a little bit more about your role, especially at Ford?
Sure, happy to. Really thankful to DVC for inviting me to the panel. I'm really looking forward to a fun and exciting discussion. So my role at Ford, I have been at Ford for about 9 years now. And in my current role, I help with the point of view around blockchain and IoT technologies in a number of areas across the enterprise. But while my focus is mostly around manufacturing and supply chain processes, but I also help out with the point of view for all the enterprise connectivity side of the vehicle, as well as other use cases such as responsible sourcing of raw material and ethical sourcing and so on. So I'm really thankful to be in my role because it allows me to be part of a cross-functional team that goes across the enterprise and really learn about the different applications of distributed ledger technologies that one could play around with and research inside the company as well as also inside the industry. And I also do want to briefly mention Mobi and our work at Mobi because, I do want to say that DID is pretty new for automotive industry. The industry is just catching up with it. So whatever I have to share today is mostly the work we have been doing at Mobi with industry partners. We don't really have any sport specific use cases for DID. So my role, whatever I actually know about DID, is from my partnership with Mobi. So it is across industry nonprofit consortium for creating automotive blockchain standards and reference architectures about how to leverage technologies like DID and verifiable credential and give the vehicle a unique identity, as well as also maybe give parts unique identity, especially in the aftermarket when we are trying to track service parts and trying to understand their provenance as well as their ethical sourcing and all of that. So it's a really exciting field. And at Mobi, we decided that, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. That's why we really look at some of the other awesome standards, such as W3C standards, DID, and verifiable credential. And our work mostly focuses on how we can apply our automotive business knowledge and make use of those available standards for vehicle and automotive business related use cases. So that's me, and I look forward to chatting.
Awesome. And I'll toss it over to you, Daniel, and give us a little more background on what you're doing.
Yeah, so we're working on, really building out infrastructure for decentralized identity in general, including, our latest release of, one of the more foundational components, this ION network protocol that runs on Bitcoin. There's several components we put out, open source components, standards that we helped build, really all in service to our first use case, which is creating verifiable credential service that's integrated into Azure AD. Azure AD is basically the identity system that runs the back end enterprise identity systems for the vast majority of the world, the Fortune 10,000. So pretty much every industry out there runs on Microsoft's identity services. So we're trying to make it so every company that's on AAD can be an issuer of credentials against DIDs that users own, not, like a centralized ID that Microsoft or, agency or government owns.
Okay. So we're going to talk around decentralized ID in sort of a high level fashion. We will have a little time for an open Q&A. So if you have, especially if you want to delve a little bit more in depth, please feel free to leave them in the chat, and then we'll try to get to as many as we can near the end. But keeping in that spirit, and especially on the higher level, I'll start with you, Daniel. Can you sort of explain where we are currently just with ID in general and what makes decentralized IDs any different?
Yeah, so I mean, the current ID today that you have online is generally email addresses or centralized usernames or at handles, which are usernames in some apps, and those are the things that you form connections through, and you transact with other people and devices using. And so those identifiers are owned by really those companies, right? I mean, your email address is owned by a company, so is your at handle on Twitter, things like that. And that's fine in certain cases, right? But the line increasingly blurs when you start attaching things to IDs that are beyond really trivial, sort of, when it was cat pictures on Facebook, right? It didn't really matter a whole lot. I mean, you could turn and burn those IDs and not really care too much, but when it starts becoming like vital proofs that are digitized, that used to be paper proofs, whether it's government or otherwise, or even on Twitter or social media, we're seeing different viewpoints, whether we agree with these people's perspectives or not. There's a degree of censorship there, and it'd be one thing if your ID was just people just didn't follow it, but it's another thing if your IDs get cut off completely, and then you've lost your identity because we've commingled the idea of your ID with your content. And that should never really be the case. So we're trying to right that wrong that the internet, was created with no system of ID that you own and give you that. So if I had to answer like where we're at, we are at the starting block in terms of having the capabilities to decentralized identity. The first thing that I'll probably end up talking more about tonight is identifiers. So taking those identifiers and transitioning to IDs that you own and control. That like maybe you could have Twitter, but people would follow an ID that's wholly yours, that isn't Twitter's. So if someone doesn't like you, yeah, they cannot follow you. But what they can't do is have some company just erase you, right, from the world, because I think we'll all find ourselves at some point on the wrong end of that stick, and we just want to make sure that that's not the case in the world. So that's a really good example. We have that piece of the technology. The second piece is verifiable credentials. So the ability for an issuer, like let's say it's your employer, to sign a credential that says, Dan's an employee, right? And I want that credential because I want to be able to go use it, wherever I want to prove that I'm an employee of the company. And DIDs let me do that because it's not some system bound just to my employer. It's actually like this proof that I get and I can, use in all sorts of different use cases. And we don't have that today. So those are the two technologies we're just landing now, and we've helped with. We're not the only ones. It's a big community effort. And we're kind of in a phase where now we're going to go see what we can do with them.
Okay. And you mentioned verifiable credentials. And I definitely want to delve deeper into just identity in general. But on the verifiable credential front, Pramita, could you sort of explain a little bit more about that, and not just with identity for people, but maybe the things, how that would be used?
Yep, and maybe that's a good time to share my screen. I have a short presentation, and for the audience here, it's a very humble presentation as a learner in the field. So it will be from the point of view of someone who is learning, and not an expert. But I hope it will probably help you, because learning and making this presentation did help me get on board last year with Verifiable Credentials. So let me share my screen.
All right.
And I hope my screen is visible.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, I would really kind of try to basically follow up with what Daniel just said. So kind of I would begin with that primer with identity management systems. So on the left-hand side, we really have the identity and the data management systems that we have today, which kind of mostly exist in isolation, right? And each of these current systems maintain their user identity data on their organizational cloud servers, and create a significant amount of redundant identities for the same individual. Also, each organization has the full visibility of their individual's personal data. So there is no real privacy in this data sharing, right? And on the right-hand side, with blockchain-based decentralized identities, or DIDs, the user's identity is really anonymized, and if implemented the right way, then it will be stored on their on-device or on mobile device digital wallet, which is sitting on their personal mobile devices, which means that the user has this portable, secure identity, which they can actively control who can verify, and also can access to that data, and both the identity and the data being anonymous to the level you want to make it, right? And on the other hand, the organizations in the decentralized network can trust in the integrity of this anonymous data and anonymous identity, because of the immutable nature of blockchain, which would be used for this identity management. So this is kind of like a quick picture I wanted to paint. And again, by the way, I am not taking credit for this diagram. They are all from the W3C Verifiable Credential Standard. I just kind of recreated them for illustrations here. So one of the recent, decentralized identity management solution is the verifiable credential that Daniel and Nate both mentioned, and which is actually based on the ID standard. And you can think about a verifiable credential as often being represented as a JSON Web Token or JWT. And it allows you to validate some attributes about people, organizations, and things, right? And the verifiable credential ecosystem often looks like a diamond and includes usually 4 components. So it would be the issuer, the holder, the verifier, and the registry. So every verifiable credential is always created by an issuer. And an issuer would be like an organization or entity that would assert certain attributes about a subject to which the credential is issued. And when a subject receives their verifiable credential, then they become the holder for that credential, and they would store that credential in their wallet. And if this wallet, as I said before, for an individual is typically implemented as a mobile app on their mobile device, or for a vehicle, it could be implemented on that vehicle's onboard hardware. Kind of to protect the integrity of this verifiable credential, they are usually digitally signed by the issuer. So when a verifier would receive a verifiable credential, they are able to verify the signature of the credential to ensure that the credential was indeed issued by the issuer that the credential claims to be from, right? So the verifier will need to know the issuer's public key and the credential schema. And this is really where the blockchain or the DLTs come into play, because usually the issuer would, their public key and the credential schema would be stored in that registry, which is usually a blockchain or a DLT. And the verifier can access or query the registry and validate the credential. The beautiful thing here is that unlike the centralized solutions we have today, the verifier doesn't need to really reach out to the issuer to validate the credential. They can just all go to the standardized registry and have this really open ecosystem for digital identity management. So I'll kind of go through an example here for really using a kind of realistic use case for a student's diploma, which the student can then use for applying for a job, right? So in this use case, the university is really the issuer, and they can issue a credential to the student, which would be the holder. And the issued credential would, have things or attributes about the student, such as the student's major or field of study, year of graduation, and GPA, and so on. And so when the student applies for a job, the employer which would be a verifier, would request to access the student's diploma verifiable credential, right? So in this case, the university will first kind of register their identity and the credential schema on the registry or the blockchain. And then, so that's the step 2 is registering the schema. In step 3, then the university will create the verifiable credential for that student and digitally sign it. And the student will store the credential in their wallet. Then when the student is applying for a job, they will create a verifiable presentation of the of this credential and share it with the employer. And this verifiable credential can be the entire set of the verifiable presentation can be a subset of the verifiable credential or the entirety of the verifiable credential. And the user or the student in this case has full control which subset or which data attributes they want to reveal to the verifier, right? So, and in the last step, the verifier can go to the registry and validate the credential by checking the public key of the issuer, which is the university, and also the credential schema, whether it matches with the published credential schemas of the university, right? So that's kind of the example. I also quickly want to kind of walk through what really a kind of a verifiable credential look like. And there is too much detail, but I want to highlight a couple of things. So this is the issuer public key or the issuer identity, right? So here you really see kind of the how verifiable credential uses the DID standard. So the issuer has registered their public key using that DID resolver onto the registry, right? And then the credential schema is also identified using the DID standard again and can be validated against the registry. And then the verifiable credential also has this additional attributes about the subject that I was talking about. So in this case, the subject was a student and their name.
I think we lost the audio for a second. As Pramita joins back up, there's actually a good point in here I'd like to bring up, and then when she comes back on, we can continue with Daniel. If I'm understand correctly, one of the key components you guys are working on, what Pramita just pointed out, is sort of the issuer, the sort of standard where we have the DID, university. This is sort of the standards that you guys are working on.
Yeah, so I think those IDs that you're seeing in there are a little contrived. You should think about the DIDs themselves, where you see DID colon. That's kind of like in a URL where you would see HTTPS colon. It's a scheme. The next segment, UNIV, that's sort of a contrived like method name. So that's where you're going to have differences in the systems you create to create these IDs. So like our DID method that we created, that we helped create, is called ion. So it would look like DID colon ion, and your IDs would be, you know, similar to big long strings like that. But the ion method that we help produce is like, it's important because different methods have different properties, right? Like there's certain methods that are based on, you know, consortiums of companies that come together and basically they own the ledger and they, you know, control who can do what on the ledger and whose IDs are in or out, which, you know, I would argue to you probably isn't very different than the IDs we have today. One thing that's really special, I think, about what Microsoft's done, and maybe you wouldn't consider Microsoft having gone this route, is create a DID method that's based on Bitcoin. And that's a big deal because we've created a method for these DIDs that affords you the same level of control that you would if you own Bitcoin itself. So like there's no Microsoft really even in the middle. We don't control the network. It's an open protocol, it's permissionless, and not all DID methods are like that. So not all DID colon IDs are created equal, if that makes sense. And you should be selective, I think, about the systems you use because there's different implications on how much you truly own your IDs.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. I think are you back, Pramita?
Yes, I'm so sorry. I'm having this technical issues today. So sorry for losing audio.
No, it's all right. Please continue.
Yeah, and thanks, Daniel, for all the exciting explanation. And yeah, that they all make sense, and that's kind of more of the nuances, right? And you're right, like at Mobi, we are kind of following the consortium approach. So whatever I have learned how to use DIDs and VCs is really kind of with the lens of the consortium approach. Okay, so I'll keep going, but I think I'll kind of skip this slide because Daniel really explained it very well. So quickly mentioning some of the fun things. So, in the physical world, the user experience about how you would share your verifiable credential with someone for them to validate your credential, you could do it using APIs for sure. But at Ford, we have been creating POC apps to really kind of, we're using QR code and we are trying to experiment if you can transfer a verifiable credential in a QR code, and you can actually, then someone has to scan it with another mobile app, which would be the Verifier app, and then they have to go to the registry and validate your credential. Another way we are trying to kind of experiment, haven't done it yet, using can we do this also validation in the physical world using near field communication. And that would be, for a futuristic use case where we are trying to do payments and the validation around payment use cases. And I just want to kind of quickly mention some of the, use cases or some of the platforms that are looking at DID and especially verifiable credentials are Hyperledger Indies, and then Fabric is doing some work, and of course Ethereum. And what is most of our experimentation, my team is looking a lot at Hyperledger Indy and trying to learn from it. And then quickly wanted to share something fun before I get to the vehicle use case. If you want to try out today, you really can go try out this app called Uportlandia, which is a utopian city, and you can actually go to this city, become a virtual citizen of this fictitious city, and then can have a verifiable credential, which would be your city ID. Then you can also get like student diploma from the University of Uportlandia, and you could then also have like driver's license and other things issued to you using this verifiable credential. So it's a really fun demo you can try around. And then this is kind of my last slide, and that's really probably where I want to spend most of the time before kind of going to the Q&A. So as I said, most of the work we have been doing has been around with DID, has been around with verifiable credentials and the use cases for MOBI, right? So MOBI recently published the VID2 reference architecture, and VID is short for vehicle identity. And really the standard implements a digital vehicle identity using the verifiable credential standard. And if you remember kind of the definition of DID that Daniel was kind of sharing with us, it is after all an URL that associates a DID subject with a DID document and allows trusted transactions with that subject. So a DID document includes things like the DID subject itself, attributes about that subject, and verification methods as well, right, in terms of service endpoints. So in the context of vehicle identity, the DID is derived from what we call a UVI, which is short for unique vehicle identity for the vehicle, which is created when the vehicle is born. So the UVI would be typically created by the OEM, and the OEM will also generate a public-private key pair for that particular vehicle to give the vehicle its own wallet, right? So once the vehicle is born, it has two things, the UVI and the wallet. Now, this UVI and the wallet, the identity, the public key for the wallet will be included in a DID document, and that would be, which could be then used by a VID resolver, such as a consortium blockchain platform. And this document, then this document could create then the verifiable identity for the vehicle, and so that in future any of the messages that is coming from the vehicle, others can authenticate those messages or those transactions that are coming from the vehicle itself, right? And then once the DID document is created, the OEM would go and issue a VBC, which is short for Vehicle Birth Certificate. And the VBC is the first verifiable credential that the vehicle will collect and store in its wallet, on vehicle wallet, right? And the VBC includes things like, it could include things like the VIN number itself, but other physical attributes about the vehicle, such as its color, any other physical attributes like model, and so on, right? So once the VBC is issued and it's stored under the vehicle wallet, in the MOBI standard, we talk about several types of roles that will be granted to the participants in this identity ecosystem. So based on the role, someone may have access to the VBC or all of it, as I was talking about, or they may have access to some parts of it. So basically, a government entity may have access to entirety of a VBC because before they can issue the registration for that vehicle when it's sold in in the market. Or it could be for other service providers, right? Like, for example, an insurance company or others, they may only have access to subset of the VBC. And then the second use case would be then, other verifiable credential that could be issued to the vehicle throughout its life cycle. So those could be really the maintenance, any verifiable credential that is issued to the vehicle because some of its attributes changed during a maintenance or recall or repair operation. So a part was replaced, or if the vehicle kind of like had its airbag changed because there was a recall on the airbag, and so on. So in those cases, we expect that the repair shops would be also part of this digital ecosystem, and they would issue new verifiable credentials for the vehicle, reflecting those changes in the vehicle attributes throughout this life cycle. So then in future, imagine for a used vehicle, when the used vehicle, the potential owner, we often jokingly call this a Carfax, a vehicle Carfax without the actual Carfax, because now the potential buyer can directly ask the vehicle to show to the buyer its own verifiable history, right? Starting from the birth event, the vehicle birth certificate, all the way to all the service and maintenance history without having to go through the third party like Carfax, who this solution would then disintermediate. So that's kind of where I would stop, and I think we can explore more in the Q&A section. But I had fun presenting this. This is the first time I did this presentation, by the way. So thanks for bearing with me.
No, not a problem. Thank you. That was very informative. And it brings out a lot of other sort of points and questions. One of them that you brought out, and I'd like to sort of get Daniel's input on, where you were looking at the different blockchains. Like you pointed out, a couple of the Hyperledger projects. There's Ethereum, and I know there are several other chains who are like issuing tokens and doing other things. Bitcoin isn't traditionally thought of for something like this. When most people think of Bitcoin, they just think of the monetary use cases. I'm really curious, what made Microsoft want to use Bitcoin as the verification? And sort of, if you could, Daniel, with a little detail, how exactly are you implementing? How is Bitcoin useful for you in what you're doing?
Yeah, so absolutely. So when it comes to the DID layer, the actual identifiers, which are these big, long sort of usernames, as it were, that's the root of all of your ownership over these IDs, whether it's a car, like Pramita talked about, or it's a person or an organization. The DID is owned, and the level of ownership you have is, fundamentally based in however decentralized that foundation is. Well, I would say with consortium systems, I think there was this whole craze 3 years ago with like, it's blockchain, not Bitcoin. And I think that was born out of sort of this mistaken idea that, like, in order to do anything business-wise, we've got to do it on a private thing, which is sort of like antithetical to the goal, really, of giving these things decentralized identifiers. Now, I think a lot of that was like this understanding, like, well, all the data is going to be public, so I need to be a private thing. Whereas DIDs are public, they're fundamentally public. It's like saying I bought my own domain name. And just because you buy a domain name, right, in the public, domain space like .com, doesn't mean any of the data behind .com, your website has to be public. You could show people a blank page that says, log in, all the data is encrypted here, and you can only access it if your name's Bob, right? So fundamentally, there's no like need for a private or consortium system here. Like you having a DID doesn't mean that like all your data from, whether you're Dodge or Ford or something is out there in the, in the ether where everyone can read it. It just means that there's an ID that's resolvable to a set of keys that can prove you own it, and endpoints where data might reside that you may allow other people to see. So I would posit it this way, that when you are looking at DIDs, the things you're chiefly concerned with is decentralization, immutability, censorship resistance. I mean, that's the bread and butter of these things. And the reason we chose Bitcoin for this system was because it is by far, without any question, the most decentralized, strongest, and most immutable system on the planet that we've ever had that could play host to these things. And it really isn't a debatable topic either. This is kind of like settled science. Now, all the things that a lot of large companies don't like Bitcoin for in terms of money that they get scared about are perfect for identity, right? You don't want your identity taken from you. Some people say, well, we do want money taken from you. You don't want identity taken from you. So it sort of turns all of those arguments on their head when you use it for this purpose. And we've constructed a protocol that's able to leverage Bitcoin, just using a tiny fraction of Bitcoin's transaction capacity, which people always note is very low, right? We can operate at thousands of DID operations per second. So we could support on the ION network something in the neighborhood of 50 billion DID ops, which would mean that we could boot up the entire planet of cars, people, and everything on a single network that's open, public, and permissionless, using just a fraction of, something in nearing about 4% of Bitcoin's block space, and support the whole world on that. So we think that, the future is bright for open, public, and permissionless blockchains as the center of these protocols.
And using it that way, does that mean every time, I just went and got my brand new Ford vehicle, it has its own decentralized ID. I want to register the vehicle using my decentralized ID, and when I go to register that, is that I think of Bitcoin, and one of the things that might pop up is like the transaction fee. So are we all paying these transaction fees now?
That's a good question. So it helps to understand like DIDs. When we talk about just the DID layer, the ID and the DID doc, that's this sort of resolved document. Like if I had to give you the analogy or the sort of this something analogous in our current world, when you go do a DNS lookup, you're getting DNS records back. That's what's telling you to go to a certain server to go get a website's webpage. In DID world, you look up a DID and you get this DID document back, which gives you these keys and endpoints. So it's like the basic stuff you need to validate the person is who they say they are. None of that requires, like, those lookups don't require like doing a Bitcoin transaction, doing proof that I own an ID. Like if I tell you I own DID 123, you would look up the public key, and you would issue me a challenge. And if I own the ID, like I said I did, I would be able to sign back some proof that I do own the ID, in fact. None of that requires Bitcoin transaction. When we talk about what requires a transaction on these ledgers, it is things like getting a new phone where you want to like swap a key out, right? Or I got a new endpoint where I store my storage, which might happen every couple years, right? These are not frequent events. It's not when I log in. It's not when I generate credentials. None of that stuff requires any of this ledger interaction. It's purely the grounding of like the DID itself. So when you say like your use case, I pick up a car, I get this new credential about, the sale. That all happens like off chain and outside of these DID layers. That's two identities meeting and saying like, I validated that you own this ID and I'm signing a proof to you. And that just happens on traditional networks. Like there's no blockchain involved in that, which is a good thing, right? So we can do that at the speed that you would expect traditional systems to run.
Okay, that's an awesome explanation. You mentioned, Pramita, in your presentation about it, like taking the VIN number and making that part of one of the like the credentials and whatnot. And people like me who aren't heavy into the automotive, I would always just assume that's what the VIN did anyway. So is you can't just use the VIN to be the DID? Oh, I can't hear you again. Oh, it looks like.
Can you hear me now?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, the phone and the Zoom app itself is not always synchronized. Sorry. But yeah, I love your question. And when I joined Mobi and started learning about DID and VCs, I had a very similar question as well, because coming from the automotive industry background. So I would share the way it was explained to me or what I have learned. So, like the standard at Mobi is really meant to provide a bridge between the vehicle and its owners and all the stakeholders that interact with it in a digital ecosystem, right? And that would have like stakeholders like cities, government, regulatory agencies, and then ride and car share partners and so on, right? And we have been really kind of studying the benefits of blockchain technology for a number of things. And I think the benefits are definitely well understood now, given blockchain's ability to provide like data immutability and a single source of truth for network partners. But at the very in the very same breath, I do have to mention that some of these really some of the properties of blockchain that we really love, right? They such as data immutability, they kind of like get in conflict with some of the some of the consumer data privacy laws, such as GDPR in Europe or CCPA in California, which really says that the users really have the right to ask the service provider to forget or delete all their PII data. So this is, you may have been hearing about this, right to be forgotten law, right? So and this definitely creates an issue with using the VIN number as the vehicle's digital identity in this open mobility ecosystem, because the VIN is considered to be the owner's PII or personally identifiable information data once the vehicle is sold to the owner, right? So there are number of school of thoughts, primarily two school of thoughts, how one can solve this issue. So one is that we can store encrypted personal data on the ledger, right? Or store hash pointers of personal data on the ledger, where storing the actual personal data off chain in some storage directly. But a lot of people at Mobi think just that because that's possible doesn't mean it's a good idea to do so. There actually, outside of Mobi, also a lot of debate in the industry where encrypted personal data or hashed personal data is still personal data or not. And there are opinions on both sides of the argument. I remember seeing a Twitter thread that among security experts that went on and on and on about this. I kind of didn't follow it to the end because I kind of got like really overwhelmed by the opinions on both sides of the board, right? So we kind of like that really at Mobi, we kind of thought that let's not get, at least in the first phase, let's not get entangled in that debate. Where we could really kind of like, as Daniel was saying, using the verifiable credential standard, I think verifiable credential is or potentially the panacea, the solution to this dilemma that we are talking about, because the blockchain registry is only used for the kind of the issuers to store their public keys and then their credential schemas, and in some cases, a revocation registry, right? But those could be the three use cases blockchain is used for. The actual verifiable credential is actually, issued or exchanged outside of blockchain. So we kind of in Mobi we call it this bilateral exchange layer, or this bilateral kind of layer. It could be implemented as APIs between the two parties, but it's really kind of that credentials are issued outside of blockchain and stored only in the holder's wallets and nowhere else. And then the holder can choose to present the verifiable presentation to the verifier also outside of blockchain. So never really none of these are blockchain transactions. So that's why Daniel kind of told you that these are not blockchain transactions, right? So we kind of feel like that's what allows us to kind of preserve the VIN number, which is actually the owners, the vehicle owners, or the driver's PII. We can store that. Kind of just stay away from having to store that on blockchain ledgers using the Verifiable Credentials standard.
I think there's a few things maybe I'd want to add or clarify a little bit. One, the PI question came up. There's certain groups that elected in this ecosystem to create these very custodial sort of consortium types things. And the interesting thing legally is that actually creates a lot of problems for you, in the sense that when you create a system where you are the custodian, right? Now you enter into having sort of, you could be deemed a controller or certainly a processor under these GDPR laws. Systems that are open, public, permissionless, and have literally no authorities, there's really not the same thing, right? Like we saw in Congress, like the folks for Libra, they got called in front of Congress. I've yet to see the CEO of Bitcoin called in front of Congress. It's just never happened, right? Because there is no CEO of Bitcoin. So much like Bitcoin with Ion, there's no CEO of Ion. There's no one to subpoena, honestly. So it's a system that's open, public, and permissionless. And one thing that's interesting is user DIDs are incredibly important. And the reason why it's okay that they can be on ledger, like they can have a representation, not the data of the DID, not the personal data, but just the keys and endpoints, is because while that is a form of PII under some regulations, it's just like email, right? Those regulations are not intended to be like saying you can't have your own ID because you have to be able to tell everyone to take it down. Just like you can register an email address, and if 1,000 websites learn about your email address, you don't have a right to go to all of those 1,000 websites and say, erase this username that happens to be my handle on Twitter because it's the name that I like on Twitter, right? Or it's the name that I chose for my email address. So you can't have that string anywhere on the planet. It's sort of this fanciful sort of disconnect between the reality of systems and what they intended. And that's kind of what DIDs are. And public user DIDs are incredibly important, because if we ever want to get to like decentralized Twitter or any of these really valuable use cases, you have to have public persona IDs, right? You as a user want to be indexable on this wider substrate, because that's exactly the intent, right? If I wanted to cut Twitter out of the middle between me and my connections, because no matter who I am and what political viewpoints I have a right to like the relationships I form in life. I personally believe that. I'm not speaking on behalf of Microsoft that way, but that's just a personal belief as a libertarian that I have. Those are my connections. So if I want to maintain those connections, despite what anyone else would say, I want people to follow my DID, right? Not some centralized ID out there. I want them to follow my DID. And maybe they go get tweets from me. So they look up my DID, they find an endpoint that leads to this personal data store. This is a body of work we're now working on, where that's where I might put my tweets, right? So my tweets are with me. They come and get them from me. It's like they're asking me, hey, do you have any posts that you've done lately? Like imagine your blog was with you and someone just came and found it and said, give me your blog posts. That's what that enables. And someone has to be able to find your ID, just like I don't personally do a in-person exchange to find the idea of like a celebrity on Twitter or something, right? I find it and I can follow them and I didn't have to ask their permission. Like I found it on the ground. I found it on some digital website and now I'm following it. Now I'm pulling their tweets in. That's what public user DIDs enable. And so we have to like obviously privacy matters. I don't want all my DIDs to be that way, but it's also important that you have that ability, because most people kind of want like a personal brand for a lot of different use cases. Like I'm sure, Nate here, he wants his personal brand out there so he can like get people to come on this channel and present, right? He doesn't want to have everything be secretive. So I think there's a place for secretive DIDs that are not published anywhere, and there's a place for public persona IDs. I'm not going to go using my public persona everywhere in life. I'm going to make choices about which type of DIDs I want to engage people with.
I think you brought up a real good point. And I want to, if people have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or like raise a hand. And while we wait for those, you both sort of brought up a good point. And a piece of clarity I think is often needed, which is where you might have a vehicle or a thing with a decentralized ID, but you maybe just want it to have an ID so everybody knows it is what it is that's using that system. People aren't as rigid, right? And so a person, when we talk about decentralized ID, I know a lot of people think of like, well, I have a passport and I have one passport and that's it. It's centralized issuance. Where I think what you were sort of talking about, Daniel, is a person, I might personally want to have 50 or 150 decentralized IDs because I'm not my driver's license, right? My
Exactly.
driver's license is a attestation of some things I can do. So can you sort of?
Yeah, absolutely. You're 100% right. All of those things. So it helps to define identity, right? Identity is like a kind of a notoriously difficult and amorphous thing to define. But how I think of identity is really everything you say, do, think, feel, express, write. It's your speech. Because that's how people would define identity. People don't say, well, my identity is, and they rip out their driver's license and say, my height and that's not that's a small part of their identity. These are the physical attributes, right? But people would probably say like, oh, this is who I am as a person. Here's my hobbies. Here's the things I'm interested in. And a lot of that is distilled into the data you type into your apps. So one data point, one verifiable credential might be your passport, but I might want to use my passport in different contexts. So I might want like a DID that's my like gamer DID that I use for all my Xbox stuff or, whatever that's about. And then I have my personal social DID. And maybe I have two social DIDs. I have one for like my Twitter and my Instagram, but I'm going to keep it really suited up for LinkedIn, right? Like I don't want to cross the streams and have it, my craziness on Twitter like leak over into my LinkedIn thing. So you can just imagine like DIDs aren't about having one trackable identifier that you use everywhere, like some big tracking cookie. It's about creating an ID that is as public or private as you want, depending on what kind of connections you're going to make with it and what use cases you're engaging. So you'll have wallets to help you do this too. It's not going to be some ridiculous, thing where grandma's asked to like, type in 50-digit numbers and stuff. She's just going to be asked like, hey, do you want to create a connection? And the default will be just a new ID that separates that connection. Or would you like to make it a public persona that you have? Like, do you want to connect with your very public one? And it's going to be kind of a simple button press between those two and try to distill it for people. Does that help?
It helps me a lot. I don't know, Pramita, if you have anything to add to that, or.
Yeah, I love those examples a lot actually, and love that Twitter example. Go to you, Daniel, to get your Twitter feeds. I think, yeah, I'm gonna really have some interesting thoughts about it and may connect with you offline. But I love that. One thing I do want to add also kind of, from, again, coming from a vehicle use cases, on top of everything Daniel just did, I do like this, or I appreciate the standards capability in the verifiable presentation. So you can actually have a verifiable credential presentation that pulls attributes from a number of verifiable credentials. So your presentation doesn't come from one particular credential, but can come from multiple credentials, right? So we, like in a case where, like imagine when a cop stops you on the road pulls you over on the roadside, you have to show your driving license, registration of the vehicle, and proof of insurance, right? So imagine living in a world where all of these are different verifiable credentials that are either stored on the vehicle's wallet, or as a user, for you, I think that driver's license would be on your phone's wallet, right? And you could have a way to create a verifiable presentation that pulls attributes from this different verifiable credential, and they'll have this one unique presentation to the cop who can then validate you, right? Instead of having to carry all these three different documents and trying to go in your glove box or trying to go in to reach back into your purse. I think this would be like, that's one thing I like, that the way the ability to pull attributes from multiple verifiable credentials. I really like that. And also another thing we have been kind of talking about a lot, doesn't probably matter so much for vehicle use cases, but there could be thought of some. But like imagine for a user, so we often like use driver's license for many things, right? One is proof of age. So you walk into a bar and you order a drink and you want to show that you are old enough to order that drink. We kind of show the whole thing. They just need to show the year of your birth, right? In many cases to determine your age. They don't need to see your birth month and date. And in this case, also verifiable credentials is kind of, when you create that proof presentation, it allows that very human-centric control to the user. They can choose what to reveal or what to hide. So in this case, if this was ever proof of age was ever implemented as a verifiable credential, then they would be able to just reveal the year of birth and hide the other aspects of their verifiable credentials. So these two things to me is very, very powerful to unleash a whole new era of use cases.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things to add to that. So I added a couple links in the chat. One is the standard that was just standardized in diff. And I would love, Pramita, we should connect offline. I would love to have forward a part of diff. Diff is sort of like the ecosystem that's really, I think, moving the fastest to standardize the most stuff. Everyone is in it. Most of the people that are in Hyperledger, by the way, in diff. So that thing you talked about multiple credentials and sort of presenting, hey, I need like these three things, and there's some optionality, like it could be a driver's license or a passport. We've standardized how to do that. Something that is actually implemented in Aries, and some of the things you mentioned from Hyperledger, as well as, these zero knowledge proof credential stuff that we have, like we're working on a snark scheme. There's the BBS plus one to be able to kind of mask data. One thing, bringing it back to the vehicle use case that I think is really cool, which I think is going to be the point where everyone starts getting it. Like the light bulb is going to come on for what this really is, which is the layer for decentralized applications and services. It's not just identity, it's the foundation for this stuff. When I talk about the personal data store for getting your tweets, that same personal data store is going to be a standard that could be used for the DID of a car, where, the data that a Tesla car does, like the video that it takes from its cameras and like all the accelerometer data and like all that stuff that currently just goes to some Tesla server. In the future, using a personal data store connected to a DID, all that data can actually reside with you, right? Over a standard API, like just like I would write my tweets to the data store and you'd come look for that. Tesla, the car itself, can send encrypted data to my personal data store, and I could review it anytime I want. Think about it like a Dropbox, right? For all these different use cases where, tweets are in one part of the box, data from my car is streaming in from another. And in this way, we shift data to the person. So all those times where companies are just writing to private servers, what if they could just write to you? Maybe they don't need a private server. Maybe they just need to request access to your server, the server of you.
That's the stuff I'm sort of most excited about. All of this, especially everything blockchain, is taking things back and putting it back on the user. We get to decide versus having all these other entities make decisions for us. We're getting close to our 6:30 time. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I do want to make one last call. If anybody has a question, feel free to hop on. We'll try to get it in. Was meant to be a very big overview. I was really hopeful that for everybody here, this created more questions than answers, so we can explore them more in depth later on down the road. It's a huge world of possibilities that this releases, and I know me personally, I think things like Bitcoin was possibly the biggest revolution of this century, saying as if the internet was invented the last century. I really believe like decentralized ID, when it hits full impact, it's probably going to be a close secondary follow up to that. I don't think there's going to be a point of our lives that's not affected and beneficial to us from this. Uh, but that being said, if there are no other last questions, I'll thank you both for joining us. Ask you both. I guess we'll start with Daniel. I know you've put a couple links in the chat. I implore everybody to click on them and learn more. If people did want to ask more, is there any place else besides there they could learn more, Daniel?
Yeah. Let me grab the link to the Ion, post where basically this is a production system. It was launched the other day, like about a week ago. It's not a prototype. This is not research. This has been launched into production. You can run a node just like you can run Bitcoin. You're in control. We are not. Join the community. Work with us. Totally open source. Would love to have any contributions.
Awesome. And if people want to learn more about what's happening with Mobi or mobility or what Ford is doing, how can they follow or learn more information, Pramita?
So, well, a couple of things. If you want to reach out to me, I am pretty active on LinkedIn. So please, ping me or send me a connection request on LinkedIn. And Mobi is also on LinkedIn, by the way. And we do a lot of community lectures, which are open to public, right? So, and those community lectures are recorded and also then shared on LinkedIn or Mobi homepage and so on. So I would kind of recommend a couple of those things and to get involved. And again, if you have more questions, and if I cannot answer them, I'm happy to make a connection to my Mobi colleagues as well.
I have a question. As far as right now, do you have offer some type of environment to build on for right now? I know you say you have some APIs available. Like, do you have a client side SDK that you could use to start playing around with the platform?
Absolutely. Yeah. So Ion has libraries out to be able to create DIDs. We're actually offering up our node's capacity. We write to Bitcoin occasionally with our node. And so we're offering that capacity up because we can't possibly fill it. So you can actually anchor IDs in Bitcoin that you own with a couple lines of code and have the keys and all the stuff. And so if you look in that blog post I posted, there's an EasyJS library that runs in browser.js or Node, and it's very simple, like a couple lines of code, and you'll be set.
Okay, yeah, I was hoping you had like a Node library. That's cool.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Again, thank you both. You will be hearing from me again on some follow-up things. Especially one of the things I've been kicking around that Daniel just had posted in the chat was tying in zero knowledge proofs with a lot of this, which I find intriguing. So I'd like to delve deeper into that in the future. But thank you both. I'll turn it back over to Ryan, and thank you everybody for joining us. I hope you found it useful.
Well, thank you, Pramita, I'm sorry, Daniel and Nate. Thank you so much. Thank everyone for joining us. That concludes our discussion on decentralized ID. Your expertise on such an empowering topic is much appreciated. Thank you. We encourage you all to please stay in touch with the Collider team. I will be sending the video to everyone's email because you registered for the event. So I'll be sending this video once it's edited. I'll include the links that were added in the chat. So yeah, look out for communication with us after this. Again, thank you. I did post our YouTube channel in the chat, so please subscribe for more videos like this. Also, I posted a post event survey link in there, so if it should take you less than a minute. If you have time, please fill that out. And with that being said, I hope you all have an awesome evening.